Part 2, Globalized Capitalism. Chapter 5, Neoliberal Globalization. In Part 1, I looked at the history of imperialism and anti-imperialist theory and practice. In Part 2, I want to turn my attention to the current state of global capital. What has changed since the 1970s? How does the system work today? How is it developing? I see the world as a system where everything is connected economically and politically. This is nothing special. With the popularization of the term globalization, such a perspective became widespread in the early 1990s. At the same time, however, another term disappeared from discussions, namely that of the Third World. One reason was that it had lost its meaning with the disappearance of the Second World, meaning the Soviet Union and the state socialist bloc. Another reason was the increasing differentiation among Third World countries. Some, such as South Korea and Taiwan, moved from the periphery to the semi-periphery. Others, such as Saudi Arabia and the smaller Gulf states, became very rich and imported cheap labor from Nepal, Bangladesh, and the Philippines. These laborers form a migrant proletariat making up 80% of the population. Furthermore, neoliberalism led to an overall polarization between rich and poor. There are now pockets in the imperialist countries where living conditions remind us of the Third World. If the term is used at all these days, then it is mainly as a social category, not as a geographical or political reference. With the 1980 publication of North, South, a program for survival, the first report of what was known as the Brandt Commission, the terms North and South came to replace those of First World and Third World in political debate. These are used as political economic terms rather than strictly geographical ones. The global North is, generally speaking, equivalent to the OECD countries, while the global South comprises the low-wage countries. In this book, I use the terms First World Global North and Third World Global South interchangeably, although I mostly refer to the First and Third World in the context of debates up to 1989, and to the Global North and South in the context of debates after that point. In the following political economic analysis of the current capitalist world system, I will rely heavily on the theorists of the 1970s, Immanuel, Wallerstein, and Amin. Wallerstein and Amin are still very productive, and Immanuel's work has been honored in an extensive doctoral thesis by John Brolin, The Bias of the World, completed in 2007. However, in the course of working on this book, I also discovered many new theorists. After a drought in imperialism theory throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, there have been valuable recent contributions to understanding the global economic system and class formation. An indication for this renewed interest was the publication of the Palgrave Encyclopedia of Imperialism and Anti-Imperialism, released in 2016, and edited by Emmanuel Ness and Zak Cope. It includes 170 articles on relevant topics and individuals, and is an outstanding contribution to the field. The renewed interest in imperialism is without a doubt related to recent developments in the global capitalist system and the undeniable role that imperialism continues to play in it. Toward an integrated theory of capitalism and imperialism. Throughout the 20th century, the study of imperialism was mainly seen as a supplement to the analysis of capitalism. One of the reasons for this was that imperialism mainly affected societies that were not yet fully integrated into the capitalist world system. Today, this is no longer the case. Capitalist production has been globalized. This calls for an integration of theories about imperialism and capitalism. When Lenin was writing about imperialism, the capitalist mode of production was well established in Europe and North America, but not in the rest of the world. The imperialist countries ruled over their colonies by brute force rather than by economic means. The globalization of the relationship between capital and labor was only in its infancy. It was most pronounced in plantation agriculture and the extraction of raw materials. Global chains of production are a much more recent phenomenon. In Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, Lenin described the formation of monopolies and cartels and the growth of independent finance capital. He described how investments in the colonies generated superprofits, but he did not provide a thorough analysis of imperialist value, price, and profit, comparable to Marx's analysis of capitalism. Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, was published in 1917. For almost 40 years, there was no real innovation in imperialism theory. The Soviet Union's hegemony over the international communist movement made Lenin's theory sacrosanct until long after his death. Only in the 1960s did new theorists dare update Lenin's theory. They tried, with the help of Marx's writings, to understand current forms of value transfer in a globalized capitalist system. Terms like dependency, unequal exchange, center, and periphery were central to this. It was ironic, but perhaps predictable, that these theories lost influence again, just when the globalization of capitalism became undeniable in the 1980s. The central questions for political economists now were financial globalization and the role of the nation-state. Imperialism theories seemed like some outdated fad from the 1970s. As a result, the imperialist dynamic that continues to define North-South relations has often been overlooked. Today, the economic relations between the imperialist countries and the former colonies have become an integral part of the global capitalist system. They are determined by its logic. Capitalist production has been globalized in the form of global chains and networks. One of the most tangible consequences of this is the massive relocation of industrial production to low-wage countries. Transnational corporations aim to lower production costs and increase profits by replacing high-wage labor with low-wage labor. This has led to a new stream of superprofits and a transfer of wealth to consumers in the imperialist countries. Neoliberal globalization has strengthened capitalism's parasitic traits. The relationship between capital and labor has become a global relationship between northern capital and southern labor. It represents a pure capitalist form of imperialism, that is, a form of exploitation that relies on an economic framework rather than on colonial violence. This does not mean that it is detached from colonial history or that all forms of violence are gone. No economic system will ever be pure in that sense. Still, it is important to emphasize the principal mechanisms that imperialism relies on today and how central they have become. Historical materialism has taught us that economic development is always linked to political development, driven by class struggle. In the 1970s, dependency theory showed how the development of the periphery, or, more precisely, the lack of it, was dependent on the core countries. Today, the core countries have become dependent on production in the periphery. To speak of producer economies and consumer economies more accurately describes current global economic relationships than the terminology formerly used by dependency theorists. Today, the proletariat in the South does not play a peripheral but a very central role in the capitalist world system. Its exploitation is not a minor aspect of the system but one of its principal features. In order to account for this theoretically, we need to integrate theories of capitalism and imperialism. We need one theory for the entire global system. With regard to both the historical overview above and the following sketch of today's global economy, I would define imperialism as an expansion of the capitalist mode of production made necessary by its inherent contradictions. This implies a value transfer that polarizes the system and creates a center and a periphery. One consequence being that class struggles in the center and the periphery unfold under very different circumstances. Globally, individual nation-states vie for dominance. Imperialist countries compete with the countries of the periphery and with one another. There is a permanent struggle for hegemony. This reflects back on the economy. The classes involved either try to optimize the economic system to serve their interests, or they try to destroy it. The dialectical process between the laws of capital and their political consequences, in the form of class struggle, is the engine that drives everything. It is this dynamic that I want to discuss in this chapter. The origins of neoliberal globalization can be found in the 1950s, when an increasing number of firms became transnational. Corporations that belonged to monopolies based in the US, Western Europe, and Japan established branches in other countries to secure easier access to raw materials and markets. The oil industry with companies like Exxon, Shell, and BP is one example. It was the resistance against these companies' global expansion that made OPEC dramatically raise the price for crude oil in the 1970s, which caused a major crisis for global capital. The solution was neoliberalism. Neo because classical liberalism had played a big role in the early development of the capitalist system. From 1870 to 1913, liberal ideas had a particular influence on the development of capitalism. There was an enormous increase in international trade, integration of markets, financial interdependence, and migration. The basic ideological principles of neoliberalism had already been formulated by F.A. Hayek in the 1930s. In the 1970s, Hayek's work was rediscovered by a number of liberal economists eager to present alternatives to Keynesianism, which had become the dominant economic theory in Europe and the U.S. after it helped resolve the economic crisis of the 1930s. Multinational corporations embraced neoliberalism as it promised to relieve the pressure of nation-state regulations on investment and trade. They wanted to move from being multinational to transnational. Neoliberalism meant that ties between the U.S., Western Europe, and Japan became very close. They formed a triad, meaning a united imperialist leadership. Semi-annual meetings between the leaders of the most powerful capitalist nations were introduced, a number of transnational institutions were established, and numerous free trade agreements signed. This must not be mistaken for the creation of a world government regulating global capitalism. Individual states, and their classes, still have, and defend, their national interests. The U.S. wants U.S. capital to come out on top, Germany German capital, and so on. Transnational corporations do not stand in opposition to the state as such. Rather, they ally themselves with states that serve their interests. National differences, for example in wages and taxes, are essential to maximize profit. These differences could not exist if states didn't exist. Transnational corporations benefit from the competition between states to offer capital the best conditions in terms of taxes, infrastructure, security, etc. They especially benefit from the wide gap between the global North and the global South. The centers of accumulation, that is, the financial, legal, and executive headquarters, remain restricted to certain states. These are the states that the transnational corporations remain most closely connected to, for historical, political, and economic reasons. They guarantee the security of capital at home and protect its interests abroad. It is also the state that enforces property rights. Neoliberal treaties and agreements to regulate transnational trade, investment, and copyright have created a new global institutional architecture. The aim is to create stability for transnational corporations and increase their influence on state policies, particularly with regard to labor. It is the state that imposes this on the people, though, and it is only the state that has the power to enforce economic, political, and military sanctions. President Obama made no effort to conceal this in a talk he gave at Nike headquarters in May 2015. We have to make sure America writes the rules of the global economy. And we should do it today, while our economy is in the position of global strength. Because if we don't write the rules for trade around the world, guess what? China will. The neoliberal breakthrough came when liberal think tanks and lobbyists from multinational corporations joined forces with conservative politicians. Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US combined social and cultural conservatism with a liberal critique of government intervention in the economy. This approach was later adopted by European Social Democrats, and a process exemplified by Tony Blair's New Labour. New legislative and institutional frameworks for global relations were established as well. The Schengen Agreement was signed in 1985, the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1993, and the founding papers of the World Trade Organization in 1995. Apart from the G meetings, the annual World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, is now of major importance, and there are also the Bilderberg meetings as well as other formal or informal get-togethers of the world's political and economic leaders. At the same time, the former Soviet republics, Eastern Europe, and China were integrated into the global capitalist market. This contributed to economic growth and neoliberalism's two-decade-long honeymoon. Neoliberalism would not have been possible without the development of the productive forces, especially in transport and communications. The introduction of the standard size container for land and sea transport, designed by Malcolm McLean in 1956, was one such innovation. McLean's container could easily be moved from ships to trains and trucks. The unloading of cargo ships, which once took days, or even weeks, could now be completed within hours. Costs for long-distance shipping were reduced by 97%. The standard-size container became the norm during the Vietnam War. The quantity of U.S. military equipment sent to the region made the container customary in all of East Asia. Since 1980, container transport by sea has grown by 1,550%. 95% of the foodstuffs, clothes, cars, and electronics we consume are shipped in containers. More than 20 million of them circumnavigate the globe. The biggest cargo ships can carry 20,000, which translates into 40,000 cars, 117 million pairs of shoes, or 745 million bananas. Labor has become a much more relevant cost factor in production than transport. A number of industries, including the automobile and electronics industry, are taking full advantage of the low wages of Asian and Latin American countries. This would be impossible without the standard-size container. The container became the hidden link between the producer countries in the South and the consumer countries in the North. Personal computers, mobile phones, email, the Internet, and other new forms of communication technology have revolutionized the global stream of information. They have also revolutionized management. One example is the just-in-time model, which minimizes production time as well as storage costs by delivering the material used in production at exactly the right time to the right place. In short, communications and logistics have become central to the production process. The innovations in transport and communications have made it possible to divide the production process into numerous steps that don't need to be geographically linked. Production is coordinated in networks and chains, whether they connect different floors in a building, or offices, workshops, or factories across the globe. Capital is no longer bound to specific sites of production as location has become incredibly flexible. Capital can employ labor wherever it makes production most profitable. Laborers, on the other hand, are bound to the places where they earn a living. They have become highly vulnerable pawns in the global capitalist game. The concentration of capital that Hobson, Lenin, and Hilferding identified as a prime feature of capitalism in the early 1900s remained a prime feature of capitalism throughout the 20th century. The emergence of transnational corporations is as much an indication of this as the emergence of monopolies. Samir Amin speaks of generalized monopoly capitalism when referring to capitalism's current phase. When we speak of monopolies, we don't just mean big corporations dominating industries. We mean networks that dominate the entire productive system. The Swiss Federal Institute of Technology developed a model to map the ownership of transnational corporations. Out of 37 million companies, they identified 147 that, through interlocking stakes and share ownerships, account for 40% of the wealth created by all companies combined. 737 account for 80%. 10 companies account for 76% of the world's automobile production, 2 companies for 95% of the world's airplane production, and 1 company controls 60% of the world market for microprocessors. 6 companies control 85% of the global production of car tires, 7 companies account for 90% of the world's medical equipment, and 2 companies produce 80% of the world's ground coffee. 5 companies control 77% of world trade in corn, 3 companies control 80% of the world market for bananas, and 87% of the world market for tobacco is in the hands of 4 companies. Small and medium-sized firms serve as suppliers to the monopolists, which take a significant share of their profits. This means they make a super profit, that is, a profit above the average profit rate. So-called intellectual property rights constitute a new dimension of capitalist monopolization. It is impossible to protect these rights without the help of the state. The northern countries have signed numerous treaties to this end. The agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights is meant to protect the superprofits of the monopolies based in the North. In 2010, they accounted for 98% of all royalties and licenses linked to intellectual property. In absolute numbers, they earned $237 billion from them. Some industries are particularly dependent on patents and trademarks: fashion, design, electronics, software, and pharmaceuticals. The pharmaceutical industry illustrates the profit margins at stake particularly well. Doctors Without Borders has estimated that when generic versions of patented medicines to treat HIV infection became accessible in the year 2000, the annual cost of treating an HIV-positive patient in India dropped from $10,000 to $150. The global division of labor. During the past 30 years, there has been a fundamental change in the global division of labor. From capitalism's very beginning up to the 1970s, the countries of the periphery mainly served as sources of raw materials and tropical agricultural products. In the 1950s, industrial goods made up only 15% of the exports of all third world countries combined. By 2009, the number had risen to 70%. Industrial labor had, with rapid speed, been moved from the global north to the global south. Outsourcing began in the 1970s with trade capital moving the production of shoes, clothes, toys, and kitchenware to low-wage countries. The next wave saw U.S. electronics giants such as Cisco, Sun Microsystems, Garmin, and AT&T moving their production to South Korea and Taiwan in response to increasing competition from Japan. The latest and strongest wave was prompted by China entering the global market in the 1990s. Between 1990 and 2000, every year 100,000 industrial jobs were moved from the U.S. to the global south. In 2002, it was 200,000 jobs, and, in 2004, no less than 400,000. The constant increase only stopped with the financial crisis of 2007. In total, the global labor force engaged in capitalist production rose from 1.9 to 3.1 billion people between 1980 and 2011. That is an increase of 61%. Three-quarters of this workforce live in the global south. Together, China and India account for 40% of the world's labor force. India joined the WTO in 1995, China in 2001. And the former Soviet republics and the countries of Eastern Europe were integrated into the global capitalist market around the same time. This meant an expansion of capitalism of historic magnitude, comparable to the abolition of feudalism. We have witnessed a modern-day form of primitive accumulation. At the same time, millions of workers lost their jobs in government-owned industries and were turned into an additional low-wage sector of global capitalism. Figure 2 below illustrates the changes in the global division of industrial labor between 1950 and 2012. In 1980, the numbers of industrial workers in the global south and global north were about equal. In 2010, there were 541 million industrial workers in the global south, while only 145 million remained in the global north. The proletariat of the South has become much more entrenched in the global economy and is of much greater importance for its continued development. The center of gravity for global industrial production no longer lies in the global North, but in the global South. Not all of the countries in the global South are affected by this in the same way. The industrialization of the global South is concentrated in 23 countries that comprise 76% of the global South's population. In the other 107 countries that the International Labor Organization lists as belonging to the Global South, the export of raw materials and agricultural products remains the mainstay of the economy. The countries with the strongest level of industrialization include those with rich oil reserves, such as Saudi Arabia, the smaller Gulf states, Nigeria, and Venezuela. Meanwhile, the countries of Central Africa have become even more marginalized. Even within the industrialized countries of the South, there are big regional differences. Industrialization often remains restricted to so-called export processing zones, with generous tax breaks and heavy restrictions on organized labor. In 2006, there existed 2,700 export processing zones employing 63 million people. In China, export-oriented industrial production is concentrated along the Pearl River and the cities of Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou. Agriculture in the South has also undergone big changes. Agricultural production has been integrated into the global market and a new rural proletariat has emerged, involved in the production of tropical timber, vegetable oil, coffee, tea, meat, and fodder. More effective means of transport and cold chains have radically transformed the global market for fruits, vegetables, and flowers. These are now available in all shapes and forms year-round for customers in the North. In most cases, at a relatively low price. 80% of the workforce in this so-called non-traditional agricultural sector consists of women. They have very little protection against the pesticides they are exposed to. The market itself is controlled by a handful of global distributors and supermarket chains such as Tesco and Walmart. Outsourcing is not limited to industrial and agricultural labor. It is also a major factor in the service industry. Services that can be moved are moved. Mumbai, for example, has become the global center for IT services. Labor costs for an Indian software engineer, programmer, or data assistant are a fraction of what employers would have to pay in North America or Europe. Telephone services, accounting, and design are also increasingly being moved to the South. For workers in the North, this means that competition for the most lucrative and best-paid positions in the global division of labor has intensified. Higher education has become more important than ever. Everyone is looking for a head start in the job race. Even at the higher levels of employment, the South has become a threat. In recent years, numerous higher-level educational institutions have been established in low-wage countries. Research is also moving there. In the long run, the North is destined to be the loser in the competition it has unleashed. In the 1980s, it became popular to describe Western societies as post-industrial. Immaterial labor, meaning labor related to knowledge, information, communications, service, creativity, and what has been dubbed the experience economy, became increasingly important. We are a far cry from a post-industrial world. However, computers, screens, smartphones, and all the other consumer goods we use in ever-increasing quantities are produced by actual people. Globally, there are more industrial workers today than 4 decades ago, not less. Industrial production has not disappeared, it has only been moved out of sight if you live in the global North. While the labor is done in the South, it is still controlled by the North, which handles finance and trade, and enforces property rights. The industrialization of the South goes hand in hand with the rise of unproductive labor in the North. Today, about half of the workforce in the North is involved in unproductive labor. As an article in The Economist put it in 2012, factory floors today often seem deserted, whereas the office blocks nearby are full of designers, IT specialists, accountants, logistics experts, marketing staff, customer relations managers, cooks, and cleaners. Economists have characterized the present phase of globalization as one in which production and the realization of value are more delinked geographically than ever before. It is important to remember that everything consumed by workers involved in both productive and unproductive labor comes from the productive sector. Let us look at the security guards hired at factories as an example to illustrate this. They create a common good, security. But if the number of security workers is rising in relation to industrial workers, then the average production per worker declines. Security workers are reliant on the value produced by industrial workers. Hence, the rise of unproductive labor in the North depends on the increased exploitation of productive labor in the South. Otherwise, profits would fall. Already in 1990, James Devine pointed out that if the center uses unproductive labor more than the world average, then value will be transferred to the center. William Milberg has noted that many manufacturing firms now do no manufacturing at all, providing only brand design, marketing, supply chain logistics, and financial management services. He explains how this is directly linked to falling import prices, which have been essential for maintaining high profit rates. Milberg also links finance capitalism in the North to the low prices for products manufactured in the South. Reduced production costs brought increased profit shares that were retained and reinvested. The correlation between financialization in the North and the creation of value in the South is expressed in the fact that the corporations most dependent on cheap imports are also the most financialized, in terms of shareholder value. As Steve Naus concludes, the expansion of finance, as with marketing, logistics coordination, and other prominent types of unproductive labor commonly seen in the North in recent decades, provides a strong indication that transfers of value remain a prominent feature of global political economy in the 21st century. For about 50 years, economists have been telling developing countries that industrialization will allow them to catch up with the rich countries. All the poor countries had to do was emulate Europe and North America. But the current industrialization of the South cannot be compared to the industrialization of Europe and North America more than a century ago. Circumstances are entirely different. The industrialization of the North was made possible by tariff barriers and a strong domestic market. It was made possible by colonialism and imperialism. The current industrialization of the South is entirely dependent on exports. There are no industrial monopolies in the South. To the contrary, the industrialization of the South is characterized by fierce competition. The monopolies based in the North can choose between numerous suppliers. Furthermore, the South has no peripheries to exploit, and the vast majority of the profits go to the North. It is very difficult for the workforce of the South to gain higher wages. There exists a large reserve army of labor, millions of unemployed men and women desperately seeking employment, and migration laws make it virtually impossible for them to move to countries where wages are higher. The doors to the North are only open for those sections of the population whose skills are needed, and there are no longer any undiscovered continents to settle in. When industrial jobs were moved to the South, wage levels did not move with them. This is hardly surprising. The low wages of the South were the reason the jobs were moved to begin with. Industrialization brought some countries in the South a higher GDP, but this mainly benefited new upper and middle classes. Real wages for the working classes have hardly risen at all. The industrialization of China, South Africa, and Brazil is not paving the way to a life resembling that of the European or North American working classes. It is impossible to export the goods produced in the South for low prices to the North and establish a consumer society in the South at the same time. The industrialization of the South depends on the purchasing power of the North. While capitalist development in the North was characterized by a balance between supply and purchasing power, no such balance exists in the South. Nor can it within the current world system. The low wages of the South require a large reserve army of labor. This is confirmed by data from the United Nations International Labor Organization. In 2011, the ILO divided the global workforce into the following groups. 1.4 billion wage laborers, some of them working part-time and with insecure employment. 1.7 billion people working in the so-called informal sector, which includes servants, street vendors, and a rural proletariat involved in subsistence farming. Despite the fact that they work, they are registered as unemployed and form what Marx called the latent part of the reserve army of labor. 218 million unemployed laborers, they constitute what Marx called the floating part of the reserve army of labor. 538 million people of prime working age who are classified as economically inactive. This is a heterogeneous group consisting of students, disabled people, prisoners, and what Marx called the lumpenproletariat. If we look at the last three categories, it means that the global reserve army of labor consists of 2.4 billion people. If we compare this with the 1.4 billion wage laborers, the reserve army of labor is 70% larger. The vast majority of the people who belong to it live in the global South. This is one of the main reasons why it is so unlikely for wage levels there to increase. The rise of finance capital. Capital's profits come, in general, from the production of goods. The profits of finance capital, however, come from the circulation of money. Finance capital is money that creates more money, or, at least, it appears so. In truth, finance capital is, in various ways, dependent on productive capital. The original form of finance capital was bank capital. Banks redistribute capital from those who have a lot to those who have little. They loan money to investors and grant credit to consumers. They transfer money from one account to another. This, they have done for centuries. In the 15th century banks of the Italian city-states, gold was physically moved between vaults. Today, finance capital no longer deals in gold, or physical money, for that matter. Banks no longer need to print bills and coins in order to create capital. They themselves are the biggest producers of money in the world. If you borrow $1 million, this is little more than numbers on your account, but they create instant purchasing power. This can be used for investment or consumption, depending on your wishes. With this trick, finance capital does not create more value, but it stretches the value that exists by anticipating future value. Today, banks do much more than just redistribute capital. For example, they lend money they don't even have. At the present time, the average ratio of loans to deposits is about 20-1. Right before the financial crisis of 2007, it was 100-1. By creating instant purchasing power, finance capital conceals capitalism's biggest problem, the imbalance between supply and purchasing power. But the operations of finance capital are not restricted to lending money. They also include currency trading, bonds, shares, securities, futures, and other derivatives. By extending purchasing power in various forms, finance capital makes it possible for capitalism to grow, but this growth relies on speculative bubbles that can burst at any time. The financial crisis that hit the world in 2007 marked the end of neoliberalism's glory days. For 30 years, neoliberalism had been doing fabulously well. Profit rates were increasing, while wages and taxes were not. In August 2007, however, the European Central Bank and the American National Bank were forced to inject money into the international banking system. Banks had been so busy lending money to each other that they now feared each other's downfall. This was the beginning of a crisis that would tear deep holes into the fabric of the capitalist world system. In order to understand the financial crisis of 2007, one has to consider the relationship between the two most important features of neoliberal globalization, the outsourcing of labor to the global south, and finance capital's growth, that is, the financialization of capitalism. By financialization, we mean an increase in stocks, bonds, insurance, and real estate and currency speculation in relation to production. An ever greater share of profits comes from financial transactions, seemingly separate from actually producing anything. But the profits of finance capital are intrinsically linked to the outsourcing of production to the global south. Both phenomena appeared at the same time, and this is no coincidence. In order to become more independent from the control of the state and its taxes, transnational corporations began in the late 1970s to establish so-called offshore financial centers. There, they traded in foreign currencies and securities. Finance capitalism can only be understood as a global system. It is characterized by high concentration, high liquidity, and short-sighted, speculative investment. The Internet and other innovations in telecommunications have allowed the financial markets to become globally connected. Capital moves 24 hours a day between financial markets in Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore, London, Frankfurt, Paris, New York, San Francisco, and so on. Billions of dollars pass from owner to owner and from place to place every second. The transfer of transnational capital increased tenfold between 1982 and 1992. This financial network invests and reaps profits. It can be likened to a digital casino determining the fate of companies, people's savings, the value of currencies, and entire countries. Finance capital has been hugely affected by the new communications technologies. Detailed information about production costs, infrastructure, market relations, wage levels, political conditions, and, if need be, natural disasters are readily available at any time. Everything is turned into stocks, bonds, currencies, and so forth. What we have is a faceless capitalism and a never-ending pursuit of money with money. Financialization demands a constant increase in the value of stocks. This creates pressure on the productive sector, which is forced to cut costs, for example, by moving industrial production to the global south. The result is a higher profit rate, partly because of lower wages for workers in the global south, partly because of lower prices for consumers in the global north, which, as a bonus, have allowed capital to reduce the average annual wage increase in the imperialist countries, too. Profits skyrocketed during the integration of the former Soviet republics, the countries of Eastern Europe, and China into the world market. There was so much new capital that investments in the productive sector alone could not absorb it. This was a major reason for the increased speculation which created the bubble that burst in 2007. Another way in which the industrialization of the Global South is connected to the rise of finance capital concerns the imbalance in international trade. China, for example, has a big trade surplus with the USA. This results in a huge quantity of US dollars ending up in Chinese banks, much of which is loaned back to the US in a roundabout way. China purchases American Treasury bonds to allow the US to purchase Chinese goods. This is a prime example of what has become a common pattern in international economics, as poor countries finance the overconsumption of rich countries. The capital from countries such as China and Brazil that is used to purchase bonds also keeps interest rates low. The streams of capital from the south to the north are a result of the global financial imbalance that has been created by the outsourcing of production to low-wage countries. In other words, debt, high-risk speculation, and financial recklessness were only the superficial reasons for the crisis of 2007. The underlying reason was the imbalance in global financial flows caused by the relocation of production. Let us look more closely at what this entailed in practical terms. The globalization of production. In the 19th century, goods were typically produced within a factory, where raw materials were turned into a finished product. In the 20th century, especially after World War II, more and more parts of products were produced elsewhere. Big corporations began to use suppliers, but most of them still operated in the same country. International trade was still dominated by raw materials and finished products. The industrialization of the Global South and the parallel deregulation of financial transactions, however, have led to an explosive growth in the international trade of parts and semi-finished products. Many of these are traded between subsidiaries of the same transnational corporation. International trade increased tenfold between 1980 and 2007, and it has been estimated that transnational corporations' networks of production accounted for roughly 80% of this. Today, the journey from idea to finished product happens along global chains of production. These first rose to prominence in the 1970s, when they were used in the production of shoes, clothes, and toys. It didn't take long before the principle was applied to the production of pretty much everything, from heavy machinery to advanced electronics. Each step in the production process is moved to where conditions are best for the corporations involved. If these optimal conditions change, production moves on. Today, the parts of a new car on the market might have been produced in 20 different countries, and even its assembly might have been divided between different locations. BMWs are not only assembled in Germany but also in China. Ford assembles cars in Mexico, Volkswagen in Brazil, and Toyota all across Asia. Nike shoes and clothes are produced at 40 different locations in South and Southeast Asia. They are designed in the US, and prototypes are made in Taiwan. With the help of advanced computer technology, blueprints for mass production are then sent to China, Vietnam, Indonesia, South Korea, and India. The finished products end up, for the most part, in North America and Europe, where they are marketed and sold. This is an example of a fairly simple chain of production. Others can be much more intricate. Computers produced by Dell include about 4,500 different parts, produced in 300 different locations. A good example of a so-called fabless company is Apple. Apple develops, designs, and sells products, but outsources all of the manufacturing. Apple is one of the world's most valuable companies. In 2016, it had a stock market value of $530 billion. Most of the money does not come from production but from patents. A 2010 report on Apple's iPhone production, commissioned by the Asian Development Bank Institute, states, "It is almost impossible to define clearly where a manufactured product is made in the global market." This is why on the back of iPhones one can read "Designed by Apple in California, assembled in China." This information tells us little about the actual production process. The parts for Apple products are produced by companies such as Toshiba and Samsung in different locations across Southeast Asia. They are then shipped to Shenzhen in China, where the Foxconn company, whose headquarters are in Taiwan, owns gigantic factories. In the Longhua factory, where iPhones and iPads are assembled, 400,000 Chinese laborers work, sleep, and eat, being paid a minimum wage, which in 2009 was $0.83 an hour. Laborers in the Shenzhen factories work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Apple executives in California call Foxconn's factory town Mordor, after the ghastly region in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. A series of suicides among Foxconn workers in 2010 underscores that this is not a spurious reference. According to Brian Merchant's investigative report The One Device, The Secret History of the iPhone, published in 2017, conditions in Foxconn factories have not changed much since. If we follow the chain of production further, we find Congolese miners working under lethal conditions to retrieve the minerals used in electronic components. The Congolese miners, the Chinese workers, and the California executives are all connected by chains of production, yet their standards of living are worlds apart. Global chains of production can be roughly divided into two categories. The first is the producer-driven chain of production. Big transnational corporations coordinate a network of production where single parts are manufactured and assembled in the locations that offer the best conditions. In a 2011 study, Timothy Kurzweil offered a detailed description of chains of production in the automobile industry. Once upon a time, an automobile was assembled in a factory along an assembly line. Today, the automobile industry is a textbook example for how lean and flexible chains of production function. Parts for a Ford car, for example, come from 17 different countries, are delivered just in time, and are assembled in various locations around the world. The finished products are then sold by independent dealers. The other type of chains of production is the consumer-driven one, the trademark of global supermarket chains such as Tesco and Walmart, as well as big fashion brands like Zara, Vero Moda, and H&M. These companies outsource the production of goods for mass consumption to suppliers in the global south at arm's length. The suppliers are responsible for production, while the corporations are responsible for design, branding, marketing, distribution, and sale. All global chains of production start in the global north and end in the global north. That's where almost all of the finished products are sold. Once, the export of goods brought companies extra income. They exported the excess of goods that were primarily produced for the domestic market. Today, the industries of the global south are almost exclusively export-oriented. Some branches produce only for consumers in the global north. The low wages in the global south make it impossible for workers to consume even a fraction of what they produce. It is consumption in the global north that determines the value of their products and the profits being made with them by others. It is not only goods that consist of many parts that rely on chains of production. Most of Coca-Cola's production has been outsourced. At its U.S. headquarters, the main concern is branding, while Coca-Cola cans and bottles are filled by breweries around the world against handsome royalties. This is why Coca-Cola denies responsibility for the horrendous conditions under which its beverages are made in many countries, and for the murder of trade unionists organizing against them. The fact that the global chains of production are controlled by corporations based in the global north is the reason for the high profits they generate. It allows monopolies to claim significant shares of the value created in the suppliers' factories. The profits made by Foxconn from the production of Apple products between 2005 and 2015 amounted to between 2 and 3% of the sales price. The profits made by Apple were 30%. Suppliers in the global south often produce exclusively for a particular corporation in the global north. If that corporation threatens to relocate its production, the supplier is likely to go out of business. It is easy to understand the pressure that can be exerted. Once upon a time, transnational corporations had offices in various countries. In fact, this was the original definition of a transnational corporation. Today, a transnational corporation is simply a corporation that has the power to control and coordinate economic activities in various countries. Corporations based in the US, Western Europe, or Japan do not compete with companies in China or Bangladesh. Nor do the industrial zones of the Global South threaten the power of North American, European, and Japanese corporations. Companies in the Global South are simply used by corporations in the Global North. Their only competitors are other companies in the Global South. The same is true for the corporations of the Global North, Nike versus Adidas, Apple versus Microsoft, and so on. Labor arbitrage. The globalization of production is characterized by moving production to low-wage countries. To explain this process, the economist John Smith uses the term labor arbitrage. Arbitrage is an economic term that describes the trade of one commodity, in this case, labor, on different markets. Arbitrage allows a corporation to make a profit by buying cheap on one market and selling dear on another. The more unequal the markets are, the higher the profit. There are hardly any markets more unequal than those for labor in the Global North and the Global South. Labor arbitrage takes two forms. First, production is moved to low-wage countries. Second, labor is imported from low-wage countries. The first is by far the most important because the mobility of labor is strongly limited by migration laws, as the militarized borders of the European Union and the U.S. make painfully obvious. Industries that cannot easily move, for example agriculture, construction, or the care industry, do what they can to import cheap labor. Migrant workers toil in the fields of the U.S. and on European construction sites. Their wages are lower than those of the native working class, but they are significantly higher than what they could earn at home. According to the World Bank, each of the 210,000 Bangladeshi immigrants who resided in England in 2013 sent, on average, $4,058 to their families in Bangladesh. That same year, the average income of a worker in Bangladesh's textile industry was $1,380. This means that a Bangladeshi immigrant worker in the UK could save 3 times more money than what a Bangladeshi worker in the textile industry could earn. Countries such as Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other Gulf states have become entirely dependent on the import of low-wage labor. Migrant workers are brought into the country when they are needed and sent away when they are not. This is particularly pronounced in the construction and service industries. The skylines of Dubai and Qatar have been built by workers from Bangladesh, Nepal, and the Philippines. William Robinson has described their situation. Neither employers nor the state wants to do away with immigrant labor. To the contrary, they want its maximum exploitation together with its disposal when necessary. Laborers such as these make up today's world proletariat. There are millions toiling in factories, mines, and plantations across the Global South. The global market for labor is determined by the global labor arbitrage, which is directly linked to both the limited mobility of labor and the vast reserve army of labor that exists in the Global South. According to the World Bank, international wage price gaps exceed any other form of border-induced price gap by an order of magnitude or more. Labor arbitrage allows a form of exploitation that is not dependent on political or military oppression and can simply rely on the global labor market. This does not mean, however, that oppression and violence have disappeared. They are necessary to maintain state power, global chains of production, and the division of the labor market. One of the most important functions of the state today is to control the movement across its borders, not of commodities and capital, but of people. Borders and migration. The free movement of capital, goods, and rich people across state borders, including those that divide the Global North from the Global South, is an important feature of neoliberal globalization. But there is no free movement for those who produce the goods. This is one of the reasons for the wage differences in the world. Let us look at how the global labor market developed historically. Migration is nothing new. There have been many waves of migration in capitalism's history. The first consisted of the transport of captive Africans to the Americas, which lasted from the early 16th to the early 19th century. The second occurred during capitalism's expansion in North America, Australia, and New Zealand between the middle of the 19th century and World War I. Before World War I, there were relatively few political restrictions on the movement of people. Passports were rarely required, and it was easy for immigrants to get citizenship, at least if you were an immigrant from Western Europe. Migration from Europe to North America and other settler states was high-income migration, which means that people moved from countries with relatively high wages to other countries with relatively high wages. Between 1850 and 1920, about 70 million people emigrated from Europe. This amounted to 17% of Europe's population. It significantly reduced the reserve army of labor on the continent and gave workers a fair amount of leverage in their negotiations with capital. This was directly related to the rise in wages at the end of the 19th century. People from the colonies did not migrate under the same conditions. They arrived in North America and Oceania as indentured laborers with few rights and no prospects for becoming citizens. The coolies from India and China were put to work on plantations, in mines, and along the railways, working harder and being paid less than their European peers. A third wave of migration occurred from about 1950 to 1975. The Keynesian reconstruction of Europe after World War II created a demand for labor that could not be met by Europeans alone. Germany recruited migrant workers from Turkey, France from the French colonies, England from Asia and the West Indies. These guest workers occupied low-paying jobs, while native workers moved up in the labor hierarchy. The European countries welcomed migrant workers as long as they were needed, but with the economic crisis of the 1970s, they became seen as a problem. Guest workers became foreigners. This, however, did not stop immigration. Indeed, an increasing number of refugees from the war-torn Middle East now began to arrive. The number of migrants moving from the global south to the global north today pales in comparison to the number of Europeans who immigrated between 1850 and 1920. As mentioned above, 17% of the European population left their home countries during that period. In the last decades, only 0.8% of the global south's labor force has moved north. That the number is not higher is particularly striking if we consider the circumstances. Europeans moved to countries where wages were comparable to those they were used to. Migrants from the global south moved to countries where wages are often 10 times more than what they are used to. Transportation has become faster and safer, and it is much easier today to keep in touch with friends and family. What keeps people from the global south away despite all this is easy to identify: economic, legal, and physical restrictions. People who live in a country that is not their country of birth comprise only 3% of the global population, and only 35% of them have moved from the global south to the global north. By comparison, in any given year during the second half of the 19th century, foreign-born residents made up 10% of the world population. According to a United Nations report from 2005, the absolute number of migrants from the global south to the global north was 62 million. About 75% of migrants lived in the U.S., which has had the least restrictive immigration laws in the global north. About 7.5 million lived in the EU. Most of these people arrived in the early 1990s. Since then, settling in the EU has been made increasingly more difficult. In Japan, there are less than 1 million migrants from the global south, accounting for 1.4% of the labor force. Much of the migration from the global south to the global north constitutes a brain drain, since it is much easier for highly qualified migrants to get residency and work permits than for others. Capitalism has profited immensely from the hierarchies within the international labor market. The relocation of production to the global south helped raise profits, which the working classes in the imperialist countries benefited from as well. Their wages remained at least relatively stable and consumer goods became cheaper. Had capital not been able to stop the 1970s decline in profit rates, social unrest and the end of the historic class compromise would have been likely. Capital in the global north is still in trouble, however, as migration creates enormous pressures for it. Capital has an interest in using cheap migrant labor, but this threatens class compromise. We find this expressed in the skepticism, or even hostility, with which many European workers eye migration. With their own wages and welfare services under threat, they fear increased competition on the labor market. The political framework of class compromise is parliamentary democracy. Today, an increasing number of working-class people vote for right-wing parties. In response, social democratic parties have adopted right-wing rhetoric and policies. Neoliberal parties find themselves in a double bind. They cannot bring in unlimited numbers of migrants, nor can they alter the economic system that causes migration. There are few places in the world where the global South geographically meets the global North. At these places, mines, walls, barbed wire fences, soldiers, and Navy ships are supposed to prevent migration. In the 19th century, migrants dreamed of getting their own land. Today, they dream of getting a job. Never have there been so many people wanting to immigrate as today, and never have there been so many determined to prevent others from doing so. Neoliberal states mobilize an increasing number of police and soldiers to keep migrants and refugees from crossing their borders. The Mediterranean Sea and the U.S.-Mexico border have been transformed into death zones as thousands of desperate people from low-wage countries die in their attempts to reach the promised land. But even if they succeed, fortune is not guaranteed. It has become very difficult to receive citizenship in the countries of the global North. Few of the arriving migrants will find legal work and access to the institutions of the welfare state. Citizenship has become a biopolitical border. To receive it, you have to work your way up in the migrant hierarchy. There are people with temporary residency, people with permanent residency, people who are allowed to bring their families, etc. Your access to the welfare state depends on the level you have reached. The immigration system also distinguishes between political refugees and economic migrants. The latter are sometimes, cynically, called migrants for personal convenience. As a consequence, political persecution is seen as an escape route from poverty. It is not only political persecution, however, that entails physical harm and death. Poverty does too. Even liberal refugee policies often favor political intellectuals at the expense of poor workers and peasants. Torture justifies refugee status, but starvation does not. Wilma A. Dunaway and Donald A. Cleland Wright, in the early 21st century, one of the worst ethnic racial inequalities of the world system lies in how the core countries manage the crisis-level flows of refugees. While Western and Japanese media and politicians fuel public fears that their countries are being inundated by these foreigners, the core externalizes this human burden to countries with fewer economic resources to bear the costs. Despite the level of exploitation that the countries at the periphery of the capitalist world system are already suffering from, the core countries make them pay for a refugee crisis they themselves have created. Military intervention is an important aspect of this. In 2014, more than half of the world's refugees had left their homes due to the military involvement of imperialist countries in the Middle East and Afghanistan. That same year, 48% of the world's refugees found shelter in countries of the global South, while the countries of the global North granted only 9% of them asylum. A majority of the world's refugees find homes in countries with unemployment rates up to 8 times higher than in the countries of the global North. At least half the world's refugees reside in countries in which a majority of the population live on less than $2 a day. The new racism. Since the turn of the millennium, migration has been the most controversial political topic in the global North. Racism is growing. In discussions about culture and tradition, race and class interlink. Today's racism has little to do with fearing what is strange or different. These are ideological justifications for the division of the labor force. Racism is not a psychological condition. It cannot be cured by education or by appeals for tolerance and respect. In today's economic, political, and social climate, the new racism is fully rational. It will exist as long as this climate exists. With the defeat of Nazism and the era of decolonization, racism based on biology and science was largely discredited. Today's racism is expressed in terms of cultural norms and values. Almost everyone agrees that all human beings are essentially equal and that the color of one's skin does not matter. As long as we follow the right norms and values, so the common view holds, we all have the same opportunities in life. In this sense, today's racism is post-colonial. The global wage gap and strict migration laws have seemingly nothing to do with it. Yet, it is with regard to migrants and refugees that the new racism becomes painfully obvious. In its institutional form, it means the exclusion from citizenship. While open racial, or even cultural, prejudice has become unacceptable, the right to citizenship in a country of the global north remains reserved for a small minority of the world's population. Race is not an official reason to deny anyone citizenship, the reasons are economic ones. But the result is clear. The vast majority of the people who are denied citizenship in the countries of the global north are not white. There is even a special word for migrants who pass the economic entry test, expats. They can be doctors, engineers, or IT specialists. In any case, they are acceptable migrants. Class, of course, mitigates the exclusion. Members of the Global South's national bourgeoisies can cross the borders into the global north without problems. They frequent their homes in Paris, go weekend shopping in London, and send their children to schools and universities in New York. Global wages and labor relations. In the early 19th century, subsistence wages were the norm everywhere. Today, the global differences in wages are enormous. Efforts have been made, especially in the global north, to avoid having the differences become too great within individual countries. This contributes to political stability. However, it is also a consequence of the free movement of labor within most countries. While world market prices exist for most commodities, no such price exists for labor. Prices for copper, coffee, and wheat may differ from month to month, but they don't differ much from country to country. With regard to wages, it is the opposite. They are fairly stable over long periods of time, but they differ dramatically from place to place. The ILO has been collecting data on global wages since 1924, but much of it comes from state institutions, which makes the numbers unreliable. Furthermore, the statistics include only workers who are officially registered and receive at least a minimum wage. Concerning the countries of the Global South, the numbers provided by the ILO therefore tend to be higher than the wages that are actually being paid. Since 2005, however, the ILO also carries out independent research on wage levels, which produces numbers that are more accurate. Based on the ILO's Global Wage Report 2008-09, Zak Cope has compiled an overview of wage levels in numerous countries across the globe. Cope's work confirms the enormous differences in global wages. However, several factors indicate that in reality they are probably greater still. In the Global South, employers often pay less than what they officially claim to pay, since they evade tax and labor laws. In the Global North, on the other hand, employers are usually also required to pay for their employees' insurance, health care, pensions, and so on. This difference is not included in official wage comparisons. The differences between the Global North and the Global South are particularly pronounced in the case of the latter's agricultural workers and rural proletariat, since laborers involved in the production of coffee, cacao, or cotton are paid even less than industrial workers. Even worse is the situation for those in the informal sector, which includes street vendors and temporary workers. As of this writing, in 2017, about 1.7 billion people earn less than $2 a day, 535 million make less than $1. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average wage of an industrial worker in China in 2008 was 4% of the wage for the same labor in the U.S. In comparison to the EU, it was 3%. A Mexican laborer doing the same work received 16% of the average U.S. wage. Global differences in wages can also be illustrated by the production of particular goods, for example, an iPod. According to a study from 2009, 41,000 workers were involved in the production of iPods at the time. 27,000 of them, mainly engaged in low-wage manufacturing, lived and worked outside of the U.S. The 14,000 jobs in the U.S. were divided between CEOs, engineers, and people working in marketing and sales. Only 30% of the U.S. jobs were classified as productive labor. The wages paid for them averaged $47,640 per year. For employees working in marketing and sales, the amount was $25,580. The average wage of CEOs and engineers was $85,000. The Chinese workers received $1,540 per year. That is $30 a week or 3.2% of what an American worker earned for comparable labor. These numbers tell us as much about the Apple microcosm as they do about the realities of neoliberal globalization. We must not forget that there are countries where wages are lower than those in China, for example Cambodia, Vietnam, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. Transnational corporations have moved much of the production of clothes and lighter industrial goods there. The production process is in the hands of local suppliers. This allows corporations to deny responsibility not only for starvation wages, but also for pollution, work accidents, and the repression of trade unions. In April 2013, 1,133 textile workers died in Bangladesh when the Rana Plaza building collapsed. It housed several factories that produced clothes for many of the world's biggest brands. A New York Times article from 2010 described the practices of the Hong Kong-based firm Li & Fung. Li & Fung facilitates outsourcing for corporations such as Walmart and Liz Claiborne, which, at the time, were moving their production increasingly to Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, 3 million women employed in the textile industry, most of them very young, work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, for a wage of $64 per month. The comparable wage in China was twice as high. The wages paid in Bangladesh are hardly sufficient to cover the reproduction costs of labor, which means that there is an enormous turnover in the workforce. Many simply cannot keep up with the demands of the job for more than a few years. Today's labor relations in the Global South are in many ways similar to the raw Manchester capitalism of the 1830s. Asia's electronics industry favors unmarried women as employees. Not having a family and related obligations means that they can work longer hours, up to 60 a week, and be paid less. After 3 or 4 years of drudgery at assembly lines and microscopes, their vision and their nervous system have become so impaired that they can no longer work with the speed and precision required. As a result, they are laid off and a replacement is hired. Productivity. A common explanation for the wage differences between the Global North and the Global South is that workers in the Global South are less productive. There are even some authors who claim that workers in the North are more exploited than workers in the South. As the argument goes, only a small share of their working hours is necessary labor time, that is, time required to cover the reproduction costs of their labor power. The rest is surplus labor. In the Global South, a much greater share of the workers' hours goes into the reproduction of their labor power, hence they are subject to less exploitation. The argument rests on a number of misconceptions, not least concerning the term productivity itself. First, one has to distinguish between the productivity and the intensity of labor. Bourgeois economists focus on output per worker, either in the form of the number of goods they produce or in the form of profit made from their labor. Whether the output can be increased by raising the prices of the goods produced, or by employing new technologies, or by making management more effective, is of secondary interest. Even Marxist economists often confuse productivity and intensity. They define productivity as the amount of goods finished during a certain period of time. This does not account for why there is a difference in the number of goods produced. Is it because of new technologies? Is it because the workers are required to work harder? Is there another reason? To bring more clarity to these issues, I offer the following definitions. Intensity relates to how labor is used. In other words, it concerns the relationship between labor time and the amount of goods produced. Productivity relates to the technological means and the management of production. Both increases in intensity and in productivity create more use value, but it is only the increase in intensity that also creates more value. How much value do millions of workers in China contribute to the Dell computers and iPhones they produce? According to mainstream economists, very little. After all, the costs involved in assembling the products in China's factories make up only a small fraction of the sales price. However, if this is seemingly such an insignificant factor, why are millions of jobs being moved to the Global South each year? Capital goes where the value is. If this is not reflected in mainstream economic theory, that's a sign of flaws in those theories concerning the creation and exchange of value, and its transformation into price. Value is mistaken for price, and productivity defined as value added per working hour. If one accepts that logic, it may seem that Chinese workers add only little value to what they produce because they are paid very little. This, then, is interpreted as low productivity. Apparently, it does not matter that they work 12 hours a day under strict supervision. They are usually prohibited from chatting with coworkers, etc., in factories equipped with the latest technology. And as if this wasn't preposterous enough, there are even some economists who claim that moving production to the global south has increased the productivity of labor in the global north, even if workers in the global north do exactly the same as they did before. What is true is that the corporations they are employed by now receive more value added from their work. Timothy Kurzweil has studied productivity in the car and textile industries. His studies show that there is no correlation between high wages and high productivity. Internationally, the car industry in Mexico has the highest productivity, Slovakia comes second, productivity in Germany is the lowest. In the textile industry, both Brazil and Thailand have higher productivity than the US and Germany. Overall, in the industries studied by Kurzweil, the labor force in the South was as productive, and in many cases more productive, than in the North. This confirms that the global differences in wages cannot be explained by differences in productivity. Other factors are much more important: restrictions on the mobility of labor, an enormous reserve army of labor, and political power structures. Migrant laborers. Migrant laborers are a particularly vulnerable group of workers. They are often undocumented and prone to particularly extreme exploitation. The 21 million migrant workers in the Gulf states, most of whom come from Nepal, Bangladesh, and the Philippines, often have to borrow money from the agents who organize their jobs and transport. They are required to pay high interest rates, their travel documents are withheld, they are housed in barracks, prohibited to leave their workplaces, and often must wait months for their pitiful wages. They have received a fair amount of attention in connection with the 2022 Soccer World Cup planned in Qatar, as they are building practically all of the tournament's facilities. The horrendous conditions they are required to work under have been described in a series of articles in The Guardian. In relation to its population, Qatar has the highest number of migrant laborers in the world. They make up over 90% of the country's labor force. Qatar has recruited 1.5 million migrant workers to build stadiums, roads, ports, and hotels for the World Cup. 40% of them come from Nepal. More than 100,000 Nepalis arrived in Qatar in 2012 alone. They risk their lives at their jobs every day. Between June 4th and August 8th, 2013, 44 Nepali workers died in work-related accidents. Their wages are held back to prevent them from leaving their jobs, their passports are kept by their agents or employers, and their legal status in Qatar is no different from that of undocumented migrants. Out of desperation, at least 30 workers have sought refuge at the Nepali embassy. In short, one of the world's richest countries is using some of the world's poorest people to prepare for a soccer tournament. The Nepali trade union leader Umesh Upadhyaya has described the situation very clearly. Everyone is talking about the effect of Qatar's extreme heat on a few hundred footballers. But they are ignoring the hardships, blood, and sweat of thousands of migrant workers, who will be building the World Cup stadiums in shifts that can last 8 times the length of a football match. The situation in the Gulf states resembles the apartheid system of South Africa. A minority of affluent and privileged citizens is being served by the poor and discriminated against masses. It is also a mirror image of the global apartheid created by the capitalist world system. There are 2 reasons why the word apartheid is not misplaced. First, the capitalist world system implies racial and national hierarchies as well as legal, physical, and sometimes violent restrictions imposed on the mobility of labor. Second, production and consumption are being divided along the same lines that divide the world into low-wage countries and high-wage countries. Citizenship in a country of the global north is a reward, citizenship in a country of the global south a punishment. The question of who is going to be rewarded and who is going to be punished is decided in a birth lottery. Of course, there are also differences between citizens in countries of the global north. If you are born into a rich family, expect a generous inheritance, and have an influential social network, you will have few material problems in life. But due to working class struggles and class compromise, there have been political interventions in the form of progressive taxation, access to education and health care, and so on, in order to reduce this inequality and promote social mobility. This is not happening in the Global South. Even a poor U.S. citizen is relatively rich compared with a citizen of Mexico. For the latter, the fastest way to climb up the social ladder is to cross the border into the U.S., which, in many cases, entails a risk to one's life. Historical and sociological research on inequality has often focused on the middle classes of the global north, which make up 10–20% of the world's population. Within this group, wage differences started to decrease in the late 19th century, a trend that only stopped a couple of decades ago with the onset of neoliberalism. This decrease has masked the simultaneous increase of wage differences between this group and the rest of the world. According to the economist Branko Milanovic, global inequality was much lower in 1870 than it is today. In addition, class differences within nations, imperialist nations included, accounted for much of that inequality. The distribution of national income was an important factor, while the question of where someone was born was not particularly decisive as to whether a person would be rich or poor. Concerning the current situation, Milanovic says that it is much more important, globally speaking, whether you are lucky enough to be born in a rich country than whether the income class to which you belong in a rich country is high, medium, or low. Despite the shifts in the global division of labor during the last 20 years, the inequality in living conditions between global north and global south has not changed. The average per capita income in the global south remains at 5% of the average per capita income in the G7 countries, the United States, Canada, Japan, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and Italy. The world remains divided between those who can travel due to their wealth and those who are forced to stay at home due to their poverty. International inequality does not receive the same political attention as national inequality. It is simply accepted that, generation after generation, collective wealth is transferred from the global south to the global north. Global inequality is explained in historical and cultural terms. Our wealth is allegedly the result of entrepreneurship, diligence, and good values, while the poverty of the global south is due to its people being stuck in primitive social structures. Economic and political explanations are largely ignored. They make us uncomfortable. To ease our conscience, our governments contribute about $100 billion each year to development projects. Let us compare this with the $20 billion that the investment firm Goldman Sachs pays its top employees and bonuses. It is not surprising that nationality and citizenship have come to define the identity of first world workers as much as their class affiliation. In the global class struggle, the global apartheid system serves as an effective weapon in the hands of the bourgeoisie, allowing it to maximize profits while dividing the workers.